Okay, so for my article, I chose to focus on a study that was completed in Quebec on immigrants who came there with medical graduate degrees. The research was conducted on a total of 31 participants from varying backgrounds and from various places in the world. Um, as some background information, they did a literature review and they found that in previous studies that 44% of international medical graduates do not actually practice their professions. Okay, so the key findings in this research study were that it first found that male immigrants coming from Western European countries had a much easier process than those coming from developing countries. The process for those coming from the Western European countries was simple. They applied, they were interviewed, and they were told whether or not they got the job. The experience, however, for even females in this context is different. For one example, there was a woman who had to wait up to 2 years to get a job in her field. And in that time, she had to go into a precarious situation as she had to work as a secretary and just do a bunch of other survival jobs, so to speak, just in order to wait and see if she could get her ideal job in her field. Okay, moreover, the process could even take much longer than 2 years. In one instance, the text highlighted that it took one individual 6 years to finally get employed in his practice. And the reason for this was that he needed a lot of re-education, a lot of recertification, and that process is very hindering and not to mention expensive. What's alarmingly shocking in this study was that 16 out of 31 actually changed professions altogether. So that kind of relates back to the earlier literature review that these guys looked at, and it found that 44% were not employed in their field. And these are people, again, that come from very educated backgrounds. So that goes to kind of show you, again, how no one's really safe from being in a precarious situation. The findings in this article also closely resembled those to AllScan 2018, and that was through the fact that they both emphasized that they both actually focused on those with medical degrees. They was looking at pharmacists, and then this one's looking at medical school graduates. And those are both very high-paying fields, but yet these immigrants are having a very difficult time getting into those fields despite their education levels. And the reason for this partly is due to the fact that their qualifications are reduced in a sense because they come from a different background, so to speak. And that's kind of why those coming from France had it a lot easier, because they had a more Western background, and that helped them obviously fit into the Quebec system a little bit easier opposed to those coming from other situations. Okay, so next we'll talk about some of the reasons as to why this was happening, other than just the foreign qualifications getting diminished at a certain point. So one of the other elements that was discussed by the participants in the study is that they all found that the formal institutions that were in place did not actually help anybody, and these kind of created more obstacles for people. This was mentioned by both people coming from France and those coming from other places in the world, particularly the global south. So another interesting thing to point out here is that those who did change careers, they didn't necessarily try to chase down their profession. Instead, they just did it instantaneously, pretty much, just because when they went to those places, like the formal institutions, to get help, their bureaucratic structure just seemed so overcomplicated that they just went a different path. So in one case, it was actually found that a woman, to get around sort of like the institutional like barriers, what she did was she actually found somebody who was going through a similar situation, and she learned from that person, and having that mentor and seeing that how that person succeeded in their struggle, it kind of made them stick with their profession a little bit more. Again, they still have to go through a precarious situation with like these survival jobs, which are just jobs that people like do just so that they can make money to kind of fund their lives. But having somebody there that's went through a similar situation that can coach you was something that helped these people succeed a lot more. opposed to just fail and change careers in a sense. So another reason as to why the immigrants end up in more precarious situations is economic resources. Not everybody who immigrates has friends or family or some sort of support system set up in the other country to where they can rely on somebody to help them and speed up their process. Some people go there alone and then they have to get recertified, re-educated, and all these other things which cost a lot of money. And the other problem, particularly with this study, the problem with this was that in Quebec they don't even have a financial aid system set up for workers trying to get into like the medical field. So it's pretty much all coming out of pocket. So workers again end up in survival jobs, and this whole process can even hinder people even wanting to become employed in their profession because of the amount of money and time that it will take. So in conclusion, I think it's fair to say that even those with high education and like a professional distinction, that they aren't even safe in this labor market. So it just goes to show you that you really actually have to go like really work just to get somewhere in this day and age. And it's more important to highlight that immigrants from developing countries and women have a more uphill battle opposed to white men coming from Western European nations. And it's also important to mention that there are different pathways to success, that people don't always have to rely on the formal structures, and that sometimes seeking informal paths and relationships can help one advance more opposed to the formal institutions that are in place. Thank you.